If you've ever heard anyone discuss the NES game Fire Emblem 1, then you are probably aware that Marth is widely considered to be among the best units in that game, with some even arguing that he is just the best unit in the series' first outing. And while there is some debate to be had about who the top dog of the NES title is, in FE3 Book 1, the remake of FE1, Marth is pretty definitively the best unit in the cast, and there's not really much room for argument there. There are a variety of reasons as to why this is the case, and I'm actually working on a video that takes a close look at every lord in the series so far, but for the purposes of this video, I want to focus exclusively on what I consider to be Marth's most iconic tool, his Rapier. For not only is this weapon one of the reasons that Marth is able to be so successful in his first outing, but it also, perhaps unintentionally, set the framework for how Fire Emblem lords would be designed for the majority of the series moving forward. As the concepts of lords and rapiers are so strongly tied together in the Fire Emblem series, that when coming up with emblem weapons for all of the different lord emblems in Engage, Intelligence Systems ended up giving 2 of them rapiers. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. I want to take a look at the rapier in the NES version of Shadow Dragon. It's got 5 might, 1 weight, 100 hit, and 10 crit. It also has 28 durability, which probably looks weird, but weapon durability in FE1 was wacky. Like, the Devil Axe has 13 durability. We didn't really settle for round numbers yet. Marth having a personal weapon with a little bit of crit cooked into it was already quite strong, but by far the most impactful quality of the rapier was that it dealt effective damage against both mounted and armored units, tripling its might from 5 to 15. In FE1, once you leave the early game, the majority of enemies are either mounted or armored. And because this was before the weapon triangle was a thing, Marth gets to take advantage of that full 15 might against them, and probably even doubles them, because 1 weight is actually a pretty impactful number as well. Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light didn't have any way of mitigating weapon weight, and because Cavaliers often had lances, they were weighed down to the point where Marth probably doubled them with an extremely light sword, not weighing him down at all. Generals were lucky enough to be able to wield swords, but they were also often naturally slow because, armored unit moment, so Marth was usually doubling them as well. And Armor Knights got the worst of both worlds. They were stuck with heavy lances, and they were slow on top of that. Combining the high might, high likelihood of doubling, and potential crit opportunities, Marth became a killing machine with the rapier. And the most important piece of the puzzle? You can buy more. In fact, the majority of the armories in the game sell rapiers, and because money is basically infinite in Fire Emblem 1, Marth can just load his entire inventory up with a sword that is effectively more powerful than a silver sword. Don't get me wrong, the Altean Prince had other desirable traits, but it is pretty hard to overstate just how impactful the mighty rapier was in making him a force to be reckoned with on the NES. To the extent that in the remake, Fire Emblem 3 Book 1, the rapier was actually nerfed. Its hit was reduced from 100 to 90, but perhaps more crucially, it became a lot more limited in supply. It was removed from ordinary armories, and instead only purchasable in one of the game's secret shops. The price of the rapier was also significantly increased in the transfer from NES to SNES, and the economy was made, well, slightly more balanced. You still get handed out a bunch of money from random villages, but in Fire Emblem 1, you could go to the arena and multiply your wager by 10, which is just not a thing anymore. Instead, the wager is simply double, which is probably what you're used to from later games. The arena is also a lot more dangerous in FE3. In Fire Emblem 1, you could be mostly certain that your units would do well in the arena, and even if they ended up having to withdraw, because the prize ratio was so high, you effectively aren't out anything. In Fire Emblem 3, the arena is terrifying, with the potential for dragons to show up in it. And even when you're facing other humans, their stats are often far exceeding your own. As a result of all of this, buying a bunch of rapiers for Marth both happens later into the game and is less feasible to do. However, it's still an incredibly strong tool in Marth's arsenal, and this personal weapon is a big reason why I would say he's the best unit of Book 1. Well, I guess technically it's not actually a personal weapon, as in Book 2 of Fire Emblem 3, there is another character capable of wielding rapiers, and that is Fina, this game's dancer. Now, dancer combat has never really been a big appeal of the class, as they are almost always better dancing for another unit than they are fighting on their own. And Fina is no exception to this, but it's interesting to me that even as early as Fire Emblem 3 Book 2, Intelligent Systems was moving away from making the rapier only the property of lords. It is also worth noting that the rapier is much less useful in Book 2 of FE3 than it is in Book 1. While Marth's first outing saw a bunch of armored and mounted units, Marth's second outing sees a wider variety of enemies, and if anything, the big focus is on wyverns. Not because they are the most common, but because they are the most difficult to deal with. Still, I'm never going to say no to a 15 might 10 crit weapon on one of my more powerful combat units. So when facing off against paladins and generals, it's nice to have Marth pull out his trusty rapier and give them a good stabbing. Much like in Book 1, you can purchase additional rapiers from the secret shop, but I would argue that they're probably not as necessary as they used to be. And instead, I would rather spend that gold on dragon slaying weapons or promotion items. Now, while I said that the rapier ended up being strongly tied to the Lord character in the series moving forward, this was only half true. In the early days of the series, non-Marth lords didn't have personal weapons in their starting inventories. For Alm and Celica, this is likely a result of Echo's overhauled inventory system, and in Genealogy, the only personal weapons are holy weapons. And both for story and balance reasons, I don't think they wanted you to have Tyrfing in the prologue. You could make the argument that Sigurd's Silver Sword is his equivalent to the rapier, you know, the Lord's early game personal weapon, but it's not actually personally locked to him, and you don't even have to wait that long until you get another unit who can take it from him. The Myrmidon Ira joins after the first castle of Chapter 1. No, the next time that we see either a rapier or a Chapter 1 Lord personal weapon is in Fire Emblem 5, but it doesn't make the rapier into the Lord's personal weapon. Leif's Chapter 1 PRF is the Lightbrand. Meanwhile, the rapier is a weapon that can be used by anyone with the appropriate amount of sword rank. Which leads me to ask the question, is this video going to be about rapiers or about the rapier archetype?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Okay, I intentionally made that sound as cringe as possible, but hear me out. An archetype is just a repeated element or motif in fiction. So, despite what the Fire Emblem community tends to use the word for, there's no reason it should just be limited to units or characters. Most lords have two personal weapons, one that they start with that is often effective against armored and cavalry units, and one that comes at the end of the game to deal massive damage to the final boss. This isn't always the case, of course, but it's a much more consistent element of Fire Emblem than things like the Beowulf archetype or even Ests. And it makes more sense as a distinctive pattern than just referring to archetypes based on the class that they start out in. No, not every Armor Knight needs to be referred to as a Doga archetype. You can just call them Armor Knights. And to be clear, I'm not saying that we should start using the phrase Rapier archetype unironically, but I do think referring to something like Reginleaf as Ephraim's Rapier is a reasonable bit of shorthand. So that brings us back to the question, what is the scope of this video going to be? And I think I'm going to both cover every time the rapier itself appeared, as well as talk about all of the Lord's early PRFs. Most of them are rapiers, but there are a few that are interesting and different, and I feel they're worth talking about because they show interesting ways a Lord's PRF can be more than just a rapier equivalent. And to start out, I want to talk about the Lightbrand, because I think it's an interesting bit of Leif's kit. Leif's Lightbrand is pretty cool though. It's a 1-2 range weapon that hits physically at 1 range and magically at 2 range. And even though Leif doesn't have a very high magic stat, the fact that it has 12 might as well as most enemies have low magic, which doubles its resistance in this game, means that he can still pretty reliably deal big chunks of damage with it. especially against armor knights who are slow enough for him to double. The light brand itself has a couple of other interesting properties. If it's equipped, Leif gets a plus 10 luck bonus, which isn't a huge deal. Luck's not the most impactful stat in Thracia, but I guess it's nice to have. It also serves as a healing item. This was a weird thing with personal weapons back in the day. Lords just loved munching on their swords, but you can use one of the 60 uses of light brand to heal up to full HP. Now, vulneraries are also full heals in this game, so it's not as huge a deal as you might think it is, but I guess if you're worried about inventory space, it's nice to be able to save one slot. But stealthily, the best part of the light brand is its 80% hit rate. In Thracia, physical 1-2 range is actually pretty bad. It's better than not having the option, because with a 45 hit hand axe, you're still gonna hit things 45% of the time, as opposed to 0% of the time with an iron sword, but javelins and hand axes are going to miss a good deal of the time. Mages are better off, as are sword users if they have a high enough rank to use magical swords, but otherwise you kind of have to have a personal weapon to be able to 1-2 range reliably. Especially upon entering the Manster section of the game, which many consider to be the most difficult and combat-intensive portion of the playthrough, Leif's access to reliable 1-2 range that hits on resistance is going to be quite nice. Hitting on resistance is also potentially noteworthy for killing bosses, because thrones give an absurd amount of defense, and hitting on resistance gets around this, but due to Leif's lower magic stat, he's typically considered to be a suboptimal boss killer. Instead, people opt for the mages such as Asvel and Homer to do this job. Overall, I'm just a fan of the light brand for giving Leif reliable 1-2 range and the ability to kill armors in the Manster arc. Speaking of killing armors in the Manster arc, rapiers are pretty darn good in Thracia. You get access to your first rapier during the Manster escape sequence, and instead of being a personal weapon, it is a C-rank sword. Although initially it might as well be the personal weapon of Fegus, since he's the only unit in your army likely to have C sword rank. Technically you could have trained Lithis and Leif, but it's unlikely they would have reached this benchmark. And besides, Fegus uses it much better than either of them, due to the fact that he's fast enough to double and has a high follow-up critical coefficient. Follow-up critical coefficient, or FCC, is one of those weird Thracia mechanics that never came back, but I kind of low-key wish would. Every unit in your army has an FCC between 0 and 5. And if they double their opponent, then the critical rate of their second attack will be multiplied by their FCC. So, for example, if you have an FCC of 2 and you have a 10% crit rate on your opponent, then you will have a 10% crit rate on the first strike, but a 20% crit rate on the second strike. Fegus has an FCC of 5, the highest possible in the game. Because the Rapier has a 10% crit rate, then if Fegus doubles an enemy with the Rapier, which he is very likely to do due to being quite fast, on his second attack he will have a 50% crit rate, which is already kind of incredible. Like, that's how much Wrath gives you in several games. But we can actually do better. Upon joining your army in Chapter 4, Fegus is accompanied by Karen, a Pegasus Knight who has a one-way support with him, which boosts his hit, crit, and avoid by 10 if she is within 3 tiles of him. This means that with the Rapier equipped, and a Karen support in range, Fegus will have a 20% crit rate, and 20 times 5 is 100. Now, this would be good in basically any game. Guaranteed crits are the core of a lot of builds in modern Fire Emblem. But in Thracia, crits are even more powerful than in other games due to the fact that they use the Judgrel crit formula. Instead of tripling the damage you deal, they instead double your damage before factoring in the enemy's defense. In almost every case, this results in you dealing much more damage than you would expect to with a critical hit. On top of that, the Rapier is still effective against armored and cavalry units, which are fairly common during the Manster escape arc. So even though it only has 4 might, it's going to be dealing a lot of damage, especially if you take advantage of the crit build. And one of the best parts about the Rapier is it only weighs 3. Not only is this good because it means you're not going to get slowed down by a heavy weapon, but it's also incredibly easy to steal. The government doesn't want you to know this, but Lithis can just take the Rapiers from Chapter 7's reinforcements. They're free, you can just take them. Overall, I'm a pretty big fan of both the Light Brand and Rapier in Thracia. They're both quite strong tools, but they're strong in unconventional ways. But unfortunately, this is the last we would see of unconventional Lord PRFs for a very long time. Now, when Fire Emblem transitioned from the SNES to the Game Boy Advance, it entered a period of relative creative stagnation. Each new entry had some new ideas, but nothing that really shook up the formula, which felt like a pretty big 180 for a series that had previously been highly experimental. I know many people blame this entirely on the departure of Shozu Kaga from Intelligent Systems, and in fact, in the past, I've made that argument as well. But I think the more likely explanation is that the Game Boy Advance is simply much less powerful hardware than the SNES was. Don't get me wrong, as a certified fan of Kaga Saga, I know that he's got all sorts of wacky ideas, but I find it hard to believe that he was the only employee of Intelligent Systems at the time capable of coming up with interesting ideas. I mean, heck, even though we're in a post-Kaga world, we are kind of in a second golden age of Fire Emblem experimentation, with everything from at least Awakening onwards having massive changes to the mechanics that vastly change how the game systems overall play. My point is that Kaga leaving may have been a factor in the lack of experimentation in the Game Boy Advance and GameCube era, but it is far from the only one. And funny enough, rapiers are kind of the perfect demonstration of this, because while rapier was the go-to weapon of choice for lords in Fire Emblem 6, 7, and 8, it was also the personal weapon of Runan, the main lord of Tearing Saga. But we're not here to talk about PlayStation Emblem. Instead, I want to talk about Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube instead, and its OC, Roy, who for some reason was ported into Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade. Roy is a really interesting unit who potentially deserves his own video, but today I want to hone in on his personal weapon, the Rapier, because people often dog on this for being an effective weapon that is constantly facing weapon triangle disadvantage and can't even hit all of the horse users for effective damage, but I think it's better than it's given credit for. The Rapier itself is a 5 might, 95 hit weapon with 10 crit and 5 weight, meaning that Roy is not weighed down by it. Effective damage is triple weapon might, which means that it should have 15 might against armors and cavaliers, but the weapon triangle is factored in before the weapon might is tripled. So against lance armors and lance cavaliers, it's going to only have 12 might. And as it turns out, every single armored unit in Fire Emblem 6's early game has lances, and about 50% of the cavaliers have swords. Moreover, when I say that the rapier is effective against cavaliers, I don't mean all horse-mounted units. I mean specifically the cavalier and paladin class line. Nomads and nomad troopers, as well as troubadours and valkyries, do not take effective damage from the rapier. Previously, I've said that this was a glitch, but I had someone in the comment section tell me that it actually makes more sense in the Japanese translation, so if you speak Japanese, let me know. Is this a glitch? Does it make more sense in Japanese, or is it somewhere in the middle? Regardless of the reason though, this is kind of devastating to the rapier's ability to deal out damage. 12 might on a 5 base strength character is not going to be scoring any one-shots even on normal mode, let alone on the notoriously difficult early game of Fire Emblem 6's hard mode. But in fairness to Roy, nobody is scoring 1-rounds in the early game of Fire Emblem 6. There are even many enemies that Silver Lance Marcus can't secure a kill against. Instead, in order to carve your way through enemy soldiers, you need to have multiple units team up. Someone deals chip, and another person finishes off the red unit. This is part of why I'm a big fan of both Volt and Lu, since they can attack for chip without getting countered. Unfortunately, you don't have any other units with bow or tome access, so if you want some 2-range chip, you're going to have to use FE6's notoriously bad iterations of hand axes and javelins. Now, anyone who hasn't played the Binding Blade might be wondering how 1-2 range can be bad in a GBA Fire Emblem, and honestly, it's pretty simple. It's because of FE6's other notorious bugbear, the very low hit rates. Enemy avoid is typically much higher than most players are used to, and hand axes and javelins have 50 and 55 hit respectively. Sure, it's possible for Ward to do a little bit of chip with the hand axe, but it's just as possible that he's going to miss. Even Marcus, with his phenomenal 14 base skill, struggles to hit 100% accurately with hand axes and javelins. So instead, if you want more accurate chip damage, you're probably going to be using one range options anyway, which still isn't going to hit that 100% accuracy threshold particularly often. This is where the strength of the Rapier lies. With the massive 95 hit, it's even got 10 more than the standard Iron Sword does. As a result of this, if you value accuracy, Roy becomes an incredibly valuable chip bot in the early game. Ironically, I think the Rapier is actually one of the best weapons to use against Nomads and Valkyries, since they are notoriously dodgy enemies, but Roy can fairly easily pull 100% hit rates on them if he uses his trusty Lord Sword. Ultimately, with the weapon's low might and Roy's pretty shaky strength stat, it's not going to be doing big damage, and the accuracy becomes more replicable once you gain access to killer weapons in the mid-game, but for the early game, I think Roy's Rapier is an essential tool, and making proper use of it can go a long way towards easing the difficulties of the first 7 chapters of the game. At the very least, Roy makes better use of his Rapier than his father Eliwood does. And look, I know, it's a meme on this channel for me to shit on FE7 because I truly hate it. It's my least favorite game in this franchise, and probably one of my least favorite games of all time. So at this point, whenever I say anything negative about it, it does feel a bit like beating a dead horse. But at the same time, I do find it to be kind of an eye-rolling decision that this game has 3 separate lords, each of which has their own personal weapon, and all 3 of them are just Rapier variants. Like, I can understand Roy having a Rapier because FE6 is in many ways an homage to FE1, and there are a lot of parallels between the games. The lords having the Rapier just makes sense. And Eliwood getting a Rapier as well is a decision that I actually like, because it links him to his son and links his journey to his son's journey. But the Manikadi and Wolfbale were opportunities to do something more creative with Lord PRFs, and instead they're just more of the same. The Manikadi has 1 more hit and 10 more crit in exchange for not having as much accuracy, and the Wolfbale has even less accuracy and less crit, but a massive 10 might, which means it triples to 30 when going against enemy armors and cavaliers. Oh wait, what's that? Oh, no, this is Fire Emblem 7, the worst game ever made. It only doubles, because effectiveness is 2 times instead of 3 times now. In case you're not aware, when Fire Emblem 7 was localized from Japanese to English, they cranked effective damage down from 3 times to 2 times, so now the weapon might is only doubled. This hurts archers a lot, but it also makes the Lord's PRFs fall pretty flat, especially because both the Rapier and Manikadi have to deal with weapon triangle disadvantage against armor knights and some cavaliers. At weapon triangle disadvantage, an effective hit from the Rapier is only 12 might, and the Manikadi comes in at 14. For context, a silver sword has 13 might. And while it might seem unfair to compare it to the Silver Sword, which is the vanilla high end of weapons, personally, I think using an effective weapon against the enemy it's supposed to hit the weak spot of should always be the strongest option. The hammer should deal more than the silver axe, the armor slayer and rapier should deal more than the silver sword, etc, etc. Otherwise, what's the point of having effective weapons? And that's what these personal weapons kind of feel like, ultimately pointless. I think of the 3 of them, Lyn benefits the most. 8 might is a respectable amount, and the extra crit is nice since she's kind of a crit-focused unit anyway, with her incredibly high skill and speed. The accuracy on Eliwood's Rapier is kind of eh. You don't really have that many accuracy problems in the early game of the Blazing Blade. Dorcas and Bartray can struggle, but that's more of a condemnation of them than it is the enemies being highly avoidant. But more to the point, there's not as much of a need to set up kills. Marcus and Oswin are pretty self-sufficient, and after a couple of levels, Hector is as well. Accurate chip damage can help set up kills for Lowen if you want to train him, but otherwise there's not really too much of a point to Eliwood's contributions. As for Hector, the Wolf Bale is pretty good. It's ultimately just a slightly more accurate version of the hammer that you can also use against Cavaliers and Paladins, but personally, I think Hector's best weapon is the hand axe anyway. Enemy avoid is low enough that you don't really have to worry about its shaky accuracy, and you can hit at 1-2 range, so delete all the enemies. Ultimately, I think it's a bit of a shame that they took such a, in my opinion, lazy approach with the personal weapons. By making their PRFs into lazy Rapier clones, it not only removes any gameplay utility that would have been given to them by stronger weapons, but it also makes the three of them stand out less from each other. In my opinion, one of the few strengths FE7 has is its ability to make you love the three main characters and their relationships with each other. I think it would be really cool if their personal weapons were reflective of their personalities. What if Hector had an incredibly high might but low accuracy weapon to show the whole, like, big smash, but not really forward thinking? Lyn could potentially lean into her Sakai roots with a personal bow. She couldn't use other bows, but at least she can use this one. Or maybe she gets access to a 1-2 range sword, or something that raises her avoid to lean into that dodge tank build. Like I said earlier, I think Eliwood having a rapier actually works, although I would like it to be 3 times effective because holy smokes, 2 times effectiveness stinks. But the link to Roy from Eliwood is kind of neat in that they share the same personal weapon. I mean, Eliwood's other personal weapon is Durandal, and Roy can't use that until the end of the game, so it doesn't quite line up 1-to-1, but I guess if Eliwood got the Binding Blade, it would. This is steering away from the topic of rapiers though, so we can move on to the Sacred Stones, and this game made basically the same mistakes that the Blazing Blade did, in that it has 2 different lords, but it just gives them functionally the same effective weapon. Erica gets a rapier because she's a sword class, and Ephraim gets the Regenleaf, which is just the lance version of rapier. At least in the Sacred Stones, they deal 3 times effective damage, but we still run into the problem of Rapier being at weapon triangle disadvantage, so it doesn't really do as much as you would want it to. Meanwhile, the Regenleaf is actually kind of cracked. It's 10 might, just like the Wolf Bale, but this time it gets to take advantage of 3 times effective damage, and it's usually going to be at least neutral. It's very rare to find an axe-wielding Great Knight or General, and impossible for Paladins to wield axes anymore. When combined with Ephraim's already quite solid stats, it means that the Regenleaf is genuinely one of the better ways to delete armors and Paladins. In a game where Seth exists, he's always going to be the best solution to the majority of your problems, but it's nice to have other options, and Ephraim with the Regenleaf certainly is one. When Fire Emblem made the jump into 3D, its main character, Ike, was no longer a lord. Instead, he was a mercenary, and there was a big emphasis on the fact that he's a common person. It comes up a lot in the story, and it's a big part of his characterization. So of course they didn't want to give him the traditional lord weapon of rapier. Instead, they gave him the Regal Sword, which is kind of a weird name for someone who's supposed to be a common person, but I assume that's a localization thing. Therefore, I'm not going to harp on it too much. But what I am going to harp on is that the Regal Sword is just a rapier with a different name. It's a sword that deals effective damage to armors and cavaliers. It's even got incredibly similar stats. 7 might instead of 5, but 10 crit, which is the standard, and 95 hit, which again is the standard. And of course, Fire Emblem 9 has once again 2 times effectiveness, so that 7 might only becomes 14 if you're attacking someone you deal effective damage to. And Armor Knights use lances in this game, so it's actually only 12 after weapon triangle disadvantage. At the very least, Cavaliers use all 4 weapon types, so you can deal effective damage and even weapon triangle advantage effective damage against them, but it still doesn't make this weapon particularly good. The biggest selling point it has is that it's only 6 weight. Other effective weapons such as the Armor Slayer and Hammer are so heavy that your characters can struggle to double. In Maniac mode, even Titania needs speed levels to double armors with the Hammer in Chapter 6. And even if we're just talking about hard mode, she won't be able to double the boss of Chapter 10 with a hammer unless she gets speed blessed. This, combined with the low might of magic, means that you can potentially get some use out of the Regal Sword, but Ike isn't going to be one-rounding any Armor Knights or Cavaliers with it. Best case scenario, he's chipping them down in order to set up for kills. Honestly, I think the switch from Rapier to Regal Sword is kind of weird, but it's not as weird as the Rapier equivalent in Path of Radiance's sequel. That game's new main lord, Micaiah, gets a personal weapon called the Thani, which is a light magic rapier equivalent. So far, so standard, but the weird thing is where the Thani is located. For other lords, their personal weapon has either started in their inventory or been given to them in an event. And in those cases, it has story significance. Lyn gets it from the shrine because the Manikari chooses her, and Ike is gifted the Regal Sword because his father is proud of him. But Micaiah gets her personal weapon from inside of a random chest in Chapter 2? There's no explanation in the story as to why it's here either. Not even a throwaway line like, oh, the guards stole my legendary Thani tome, or something. She gets gifted a second copy, and the only explanation is, I heard you could use this type of magic, which I always took to just be referring to light magic, because Micaiah is the only light mage in your army at the time. It's really weird. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think personal weapons have to have some sort of magical reason why only one person can wield them. In the same game, Edward, Nolan, and Leonardo are given personal weapons, and the explanation is just that they were gifts. Rolf's bow is something that he crafted himself, so only he can use it. Heck, the Wolf Bale and most rapiers don't have any explanation as to why they're only usable by the lords. They just start in their inventory, and in my opinion, that's good enough. But Micaiah finds a random tome in a random chest, and suddenly it's just hers. I mean, it's unlikely that she's even the one who opened the chest. Usually I have Edward or Leonardo run down there with the chest keys, or Soth, who joins on that map and has lock touch. It's just such a weird way for a character to get their personal weapon, and I don't think it's ever been done in the series besides this one point. I guess it's just another one of the many reasons why Radiant Dawn's story is kinda weird. But I do love the gameplay of Radiant Dawn, so let's focus on that aspect of the Thani. On the surface, Thani appears to be incredibly similar to all of the other rapiers we've seen. If we just look at the Thani and Regal Sword side by side, we see that the Thani has 8 might, whereas the Regal Sword has 7, and the Thani has 100 hit versus the Regal Sword's 95. But this doesn't tell us the full picture, because the Thani is a tome, whereas the Regal Sword is, well, a sword. In Radiant Dawn, tome might is incredibly low. The basic light tome only has 3 might. Conversely, while swords are definitely the weakest of the physical weapons, they still have higher might on average than even the strongest tomes. In Path of Radiance, the Iron Sword is 5 might, which is only 2 less than the Regal Sword. Thani being an 8 might tome that you get access to in Chapter 2 is huge. It is by far the strongest tome that any of your mages are going to have access to, and because Micaiah has 95 uses of it, you can kind of just spam it whenever you want. An 8 might 1-2 range weapon that hits on resistance is already pretty good, but dealing effective damage on top of that allows Micaiah to be your biggest damage dealer aside from Soth. And Soth is the Dawn Brigade's Jagan, so second best to him is still a very good position to be in. Despite her lackluster speed, Micaiah can fire off nukes against enemy Cavaliers and Armor Knights, and I think this is a huge part of her early game utility that is often overlooked due to her low bulk. But Micaiah is far from the only Dawn Brigade member who can't enemy phase well, and I think her status as a glass cannon is something that is not only interesting to make use of, but quite useful for the, in my opinion, hardest portion of the game. Now, as the game moves on, Micaiah's role shifts from being a glass cannon to more of a staff utility unit, and Thani is no longer especially useful as a result of this. But if anything, I think this makes Thani a stronger tool in the early game, since you can kind of just fire away with it without worrying about how many you'll have left for the late game when it is much less useful. And a similar thing can be said about the first personal weapon of this game's other main lord, Ike. And no, it's not the Regal Sword again. Radiant Dawn Ike actually has the first non-rapier early personal weapon since Fire Emblem 5. Instead, he joins with the Etard, which just is a big fuck-off blade. It's a 12 might, 75 hit, 10 crit weapon. It doesn't deal effective damage to anything, it just hits everything incredibly hard. This is kind of similar to what I suggested for Hector, although minus the accuracy issues, because 75 hit is actually fine for Radiant Dawn. In theory, its drawback is that it has a massive 17 weight, meaning that it should be harder to double with. But this isn't the case, because in Radiant Dawn, strength offsets weapon weight, and Ike starts with 24 base strength, so he's not weighed down by this or anything else. Not only that, but it has 50 uses, and you get a second copy in Chapter 4. So usually, I just run around with Ike only holding the Etard and a Wind Edge in case he needs 1-2 range. Much like with Micaiah, you don't need to worry about Ike conserving weapon uses on the Etard, although it's not because his combat falls off in the late game. No, his combat actually gets better in the late game. He just gets a second personal weapon, which is infinite durability, so he doesn't really have to care about using the Etard. Radiant Dawn Ike is one of the best units in the game, and the Etard isn't the only contributing factor to that, but it definitely helps. He just has a really big beat stick, and he will beat up anyone who comes near him. It's probably the least interesting Lord PRF we've ever gotten, but it's something, I guess. Like, it's not a Rapier, I'll give it that much. I know there are some people who argue that Alencia is the third Lord of Radiant Dawn, and she does get an early personal weapon in this form of Amity, which is a brave sword only she can use, but I don't really consider her to be a Lord of this game. She's only available in 4 chapters, and is only flagged as the leader of the army in 2 of them. She's a game over condition in all 4, although she isn't if you take her into the tower. So it's weird. Radiant Dawn is weird. I feel like the only 2 units that I actually consider lords from that game are Ike and Micaiah, because they are the head of entire campaigns, as opposed to Part 2, which is kind of just a hodgepodge of different groups of characters. Regardless, I will talk about the Amity, because this is kind of the only chance I'll get to do so. It's very good. It is a big part of what pushes Alencia's combat over the edge. A 15 might sword with the Brave effect is already very good, but it's on a unit who herself is quite fast, and so oftentimes you're going to be quadding with it. That's an effective 60 might just from the weapon, plus you get to use Alencia's, let's be honest, quite decent strength 4 times. Also, it passively gives her +3 to her defense and resistance just for being equipped, which I guess is nice if you're trying to enemy phase with her. She's not exactly the most sturdy unit out there, but she's not the frailest either, so it can make the difference boosting her defenses like this. The one annoying thing about the Amity is that you can't trade it with other units. It's not just a PRF in that only she can use it, it literally cannot be traded. And this means that if you're trade equipping items on and off of Alencia to try to get her to equip the Amity, then it's going to be a little bit awkward. You have to move staffs around in a weird way. It's usually doable, you just need to have an item that she can't equip and trade it to the top of her inventory, but it is obnoxious. And it's something you are actually going to have to do, because in Radiant Dawn, if you use a staff, then you equip the staff. And so if you want her to be able to counter with the Amity on enemy phase, if she used a staff on player phase, then you do need to trade equip the Amity to her, and it's just kind of a mess. Still, the Amity is good, and Alencia is a good unit. I just wish she was around for more of the game. Upon returning to Archenea in FE11, the Rapier is unchanged, but many of the mechanics around it have been massively altered, and so it feels very different from its FE1 and FE3 counterparts. First off, forging is available. Technically, forging was available starting in Tellius, but it worked differently, and so the Rapiers were unaffected by it. In FE11 and FE12 by extension, you have the option of paying an exorbitant amount of gold to increase the stats of whatever weapon you wish. Most notably, increasing the might of an effective weapon is technically getting 3 for the price of 1 as long as you are dealing effective damage. 1 more might on the Rapier is actually 3 more might against horses and knights. Unfortunately, however, in Marth's previous outings, he could ignore the weapon triangle due to it not being invented yet. But in Fire Emblem 11, the weapon triangle is not only present, but probably at its strongest ever in the series. In addition to the normal bonuses of additional hit and might, Shadow Dragon gives units a variety of stat boosts based on their weapon rank. However, you lose these snap boosts if you are at weapon triangle disadvantage. Back in the day, Marth was incredibly happy that most of the enemies were Armor Knights and Cavaliers because you could hit them for effective damage. But now in FE11, he's kind of unhappy about that, because Armor Knights and Cavaliers wield lances, which put him at weapon triangle disadvantage. Suffice to say, Marth's Rapier is not super useful. You can forge it up if you really want to, and a lot of bosses are on horses or in heavy armor, so you could deal a lot of damage with Marth that way. But there is an infinitely better option that most people are aware of. Sita, who also joins in Chapter 1, has her own version of the rapier, the Wing Spear. Despite the fact that she is not a lord, Sita has a weapon that deals effective damage to Cavaliers and Armor Knights, and it is a lance, so it doesn't have to deal with that pesky weapon triangle disadvantage. The Wing Spear is one of the reasons that Sita is often considered to be the best unit in Fire Emblem 11, or at least up there in the top 3. And she and Marth actually maintained their rapier equivalents in the sequel, Fire Emblem 12. But neither of them are especially relevant. Marth does get a pretty significant glow up in the transition from 11 to 12, but the rapier isn't a huge part of that. And the reason for this is in FE12, enemy variety is much greater. Sure, there are still Cavaliers and Armor Knights, and it's nice to be able to hit them for effective damage with either the Rapier or the Wing Spear, but most bosses are not of that class line, and crucially, you do not have 80% of the enemies as Cavaliers or Armor Knights. And then we move on to Fire Emblem Awakening, and its main lord Chrom technically only has one early game personal weapon, but he functionally has two. He starts with both the Falchion and a rapier in his inventory. The Falchion is quite literally locked to him, and it is functionally just an infinite durability iron sword that deals effective damage against dragons. This is mostly fine, and it's generally quite useful against the early game wyverns in Chapter 5, but throughout my playthroughs, the thing I notice more is its infinite durability, meaning that I don't really have to care about managing Chrom's inventory. Perhaps more interesting is his rapier, which is initially locked to him because it is only usable by the Lord class. But as anyone who's played Awakening knows, Chrom is not the only Lord in that game. His daughter Lucina time travels and joins once again as a Lord. Weirdly, none of Chrom's other children can get access to the Lord class, so it is exclusive to him and Lucina. But within the story of Awakening, that honestly makes sense. He's the leader in the first generation, and she's the leader in the second generation. Interestingly, because it is locked to the Lord class specifically, if Chrom reclasses to a Cavalier, Paladin, Great Knight, or Bow Knight, even though he can use swords, he cannot use the rapier. The last fun rapier fact about Fire Emblem Awakening is later in the game you get access to the Noble Rapier, which is just an upgraded version of the rapier. It shares all the same traits, effectiveness against Cavaliers and Armored Knights, as well as only being usable by the Lord class. Now, Fire Emblem Fates doesn't have a rapier, but it does something rather interesting with its Lord's early PRF. Technically, you could argue that Corrin has two PRFs because they have the Dragonstone and the Yato, but any of their children can use the Dragonstone. It's just class-based, not Corrin-based, so I'm not counting it. Nor do I think there's much for us to talk about with the Ganglari, which is only usable in the prologue and just a ordinary-ass sword that happens to also be a nuclear bomb. The Yato begins life as a simple 8-might katana. It has 85 hit and, like all katanas, gives +1 to speed and -1 to both defense and resistance if it is equipped. However, as Corrin progresses the story, the Yato gets upgraded as it fuses with the weapons of their siblings. Depending on which route you go down, it gets a different series of upgrades, but they all result in the Yato giving a passive stat boost to Corrin simply for being in their inventory. It doesn't even have to be equipped. It also increases in might with each upgrade that it gets, and I think it's just a really cool approach to a Lord's PRF. The Yato manages to both be Corrin's rapier equivalent and their equivalent to the Mercurius, because in its final form, it is able to pierce the dragon skin effect, Dragon Skin is a skill that all of the final bosses have that halves the damage that they take from all attacks. However, if Corrin uses the Yato against them, instead they simply take 25% damage. I don't want to go over the specifics of what all of the stats gained with each upgrade are, but I will throw a graphic on screen, so if you're interested, pause here, it's your chance to read. But basically, the Birthright ones all give offensive stats, the Conquest ones all give defensive stats, and the Revelations ones give both. Thus proving Revelation is of course the best route, and you need to stop dunking on it. It is the best route because it's my favorite one. I mean, that's not even true, I like Conquest better. It is weird to me that Birthright gives offensive stats and Conquest gives defensive stats when Birthright is supposed to be the nation that's under attack. I mean, you do go on the offensive in both campaigns, so it's not like a super flavor fail. It's just kind of weird to me. I have always thought of Nor as the aggressor and Hoshido being on the defensive. That's what the story presents it as, like Garen initiated the war by killing Sumeragi and kidnapping Corrin. But I guess one of the countries had to have the offensive stats, and for some reason they gave it to Hoshido. I don't really know the reasoning for that, TBH. Now, moving on to Shadows of Valentia, I don't think that either the Royal Sword or Beloved Zofia come early enough to qualify as an early game Lord PRF. However, you might not know this, but SOV does actually have a true blue rapier in it. You don't ever acquire one throughout the course of the story or as a random drop from grinding, but you can make a rapier through the Forge system. For a single gold piece, you can change your Brave Sword into a rapier. Now, the Brave Sword does not strike twice in this game, it's just a high crit rate sword, but I would still consider it a downgrade to change it into the rapier, especially because gold is a fairly limited resource. It's like a very rare metal. It's hard to get a bunch of gold, and it's really valuable, and spending one to downgrade your Brave Sword is not exactly a winning proposition in my opinion. Still, if for whatever reason you choose to make yourself a rapier, you get a 3-might sword with 5 crit, woo, and effective damage against cavaliers and armored knights. Effective damage is kind of rare to come by in SOV. The big one is the Rider's Bane, although you can get others through forging or through combat arts. But the rapier's paltry might of 3 means that its effective damage of 9 is not super impressive, TBH. But to my mind, the most interesting part of SOV's Rapier is the 3 combat arts it grants. The first one is Subdue, and I spoke about this in my Mercy video, but in case you haven't watched that video, Subdue is a combat art that cannot kill the opponent. The primary use case of this is to set up kills for some of the weaker units in your army, and considering that both Alm and Celica's army get some late game low level units, Subdue can actually be useful if you want to drag Est, Jessie, or Delphia across the finish line. The next combat art Rapier has is Shadow Gambit, which adds 20 hit and ignores terrain effects, so this is probably your best way to hit enemies that are using terrain to stack a void, aside from, of course, magic, which just naturally avoids terrain. But if you have a physical unit who you want to have fight someone on terrain, this is a good option, I guess. It does add a little bit of crit and might, and 3 HP isn't a super steep cost. You can definitely do worse when it comes to combat arts. And as cool as it would be to say, speaking of doing worse, and talk about the third combat art, the third combat art on the Rapier is also pretty decent. It's called Destrenza, I might be pronouncing that wrong. But it adds 3 might and 20 hit at the cost of 4 HP, and has the special quality that if it's going to kill, it will never miss. This is kind of awesome, and is, in my opinion, a cool way of harkening back to when the Rapier was primarily used for accuracy in the Binding Blade. I mean, that might not be the intentional reference, but this is a combat art that can only be used with the Rapier. In fact, the same is true of Shadow Gambit, so I guess that's the appeal of the Rapier. Effective damage isn't really the selling point, it's access to these unique combat arts. Honestly, I think that is a neat way to do the weapon justice. The Rapier returns in 3 houses, but it's ultimately less interesting than in SOV. As a sword that can deal effective damage to multiple classes of enemies, its primary use case is being used for magical sword combat arts. I don't think the Rapier is a bad weapon in 3 houses per se, it's more that the majority of units want to be using either lances or bows. And most of the classes that you want to access require lance, bow, and axe rank. So even if you're just trying to grind weapon rank, you're probably not focusing on swords. On the flip side, it does mean that the few students who do have sword proficiencies or combat arts that rely on swords have kind of the pick of all of the powerful swords in the game. And whether that's intentional or not, I think it's a cool place for the sword combat students to be. It's not a trait that's specific to the Rapier, because things like the Devil Sword and Thunderbrand are also strong swords that are basically only wanted by a few people, but the Rapier definitely numbers among them. But quickly pivoting to the other focus of this video, Byleth's early PRF takes the same approach that the Yato does. Okay, technically the Sword of the Creator is not Byleth's PRF, but it doesn't really function to its fullest extent if anyone else has it equipped. It becomes really heavy, it's not 1-2 range. For all intents and purposes, this is Byleth's personal weapon. And it is a pretty decent personal weapon early on. It's a 1-2 range, 7 might weapon with 20 durability, but the durability can be restored by having Byleth rest. It also gives Byleth access to the Ruptured Heaven combat art, which, amongst other things, deals effective damage to dragons. But I mentioned it taking the same approach as the Yato, and that's because at a certain point in the story, it becomes the Sublime Creator Sword, and becomes a 15 might weapon with the same attributes as the regular Creator Sword. It's not the same glow up that the Yato gets throughout the course of the story, but it's something, I guess. It is also worth noting that Fire Emblem Awakening did this too, with Crom's Falchion becoming the Awakened Falchion for the final map of the game. So this is kind of an established pattern at this point in the franchise, although it is one that Engage would break. However, despite the fact that Alir's weapon doesn't evolve over the course of the story, I still think it's one of the more interesting Lord PRFs we've gotten. In fact, it is my personal favorite Lord PRF. Rather than being focused on combat prowess, Alir's sword, the Liberation, instead focuses on the utility of building up your emblem gauge. If you initiate combat and kill with the Liberation, you gain an extra step in your engage meter. Since Alir's whole deal as the Divine Dragon is supposed to be about them maximizing usage of the emblem rings, I think it's honestly quite fitting that their personal weapon ties into that aspect of their kit. Now personally, I don't think dragon bonuses are as big a deal as the game seems to, but it is all very cohesive together. You can see what they want you to do with Alir as a unit, and I think it's nice that all of the aspects of their kit work together. But on the topic of the emblem rings, this is the final resting place of rapiers, at least as of the time of recording. While there are no rapiers that you can purchase or forge for your units, the emblem Marth and emblem Erica both have access to a rapier. They have nearly identical stats, although Erica's is basically strictly better because it has 10% crit in exchange for weighing 5 instead of 3, but a 5-weight sword isn't going to weigh down really anyone in your army, especially at the point that you get Erica. Emblem Micaiah also gives you access to the Thani, which is a rapier equivalent, and if you have the DLC, you can use the Wolf Bale with Emblem Hector. It's possible that I'm forgetting another rapier variant, but from everything I've looked over, it's just the 4 of these. And that's kind of all I have to say about rapiers. Despite the fact that this weapon is really iconic within Fire Emblem, I don't really have a broader conclusion to come to. Other than, I guess, I prefer when the Lord PRF isn't just a rapier clone, and so I'm glad that we've moved away from that in the modern times. Once again, that is Awakening doing something right. And you know who else does things right very frequently? My patrons! So, thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Reflect, Maren McLean, Calamity Callie, Queen Eliza, Adele, They Thom, Andu, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Arvis, Belle Wenska, Dysyke, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, Joanna the Wrenchwitch, Ginger, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey and Julia Kyoto. Your support means the world to me. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to make a silly little video essay about rapiers in Fire Emblem. If you're interested in financially supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. If you're looking for free ways to help out the channel, the like, subscribe, and comment buttons always help. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.